Thank you for that lovely and very full introduction. And as I listened to it, I wish I were talking about the Quran and not about civilization dialogue. But tonight my topic is not the Quran, the holy book of Islam, but the question of dialogue, and especially dialogue about civilization. I should say on a personal note that I was a teacher in America at a prominent university, Duke University, although I also taught at University of Chicago and Dartmouth at different times over 40 years. But after 40 years of being at Duke University, I decided that I'm not a prophet, but I can still retire. You know, 40 years is very good for prophets. You remember the Prophet Muhammad in 40 years? I won't go through that. But I decided I should retire from Duke, and then I was offered a job at Turkey, in Istanbul, at Sultan Mehmet Vakıf University in Zeytinburnu, a very lovely old section of Istanbul, by Recep Şentürk, a modern Turkish sociologist. And I accepted, but I said, "Why do you want me to teach?" He said, "Because the topic is alliance of civilizations." So now I am officially retired from American University, but for the last 4 years, I have been teaching in Turkey, in Istanbul, at Sultan Mehmet University. That's a big university, but it has within it an institute which is called, in Turkish, Medeniyetler İttifakı Enstitüsü. That is the Institute for Alliance of Civilizations. So my goal all my life has been to talk about Islam within a global civilization. And now in the last years of my teaching career, and I hope there'll be many of them, but inshallah, even if it's only one or two more, I have already the great satisfaction of teaching only graduate students. Most of them are Muslim. There are actually a few who are not Muslim, but most Muslim. Some come from Bosnia, Albania, Eastern Europe. Some of them come from Jordan, from Palestine, from Cairo, from Egypt. Some come from Southeast Asia, Mindanao and the Philippines. Some from Indonesia. I'm sorry to say nobody from Pakistan, India yet, but if you want to apply, please feel free. But I must warn you, if you apply, every student must know 3 languages. 3 languages. Obviously Turkish, because it's a Turkish institution, English, and Arabic. So we have Arab students who don't know Turkish and may know English. They have to learn Turkish. Turkish students who don't know Arabic and some English. They have to learn them. But everybody has to know Turkish, English, and Arabic, not simply to write and to speak, but also to write in academic terms. This is a great challenge. It's a challenge for me because my Arabic and English is okay, my Turkish is a little weak. So I've had to increase my Turkish in order to be at the level of my students, which is very exciting when the teacher has to catch up with the students. So I'm enjoying very much the last 3 or 4 years since 2011 that I have been living every fall. I don't do it all year, but every fall from September through December. I live in Istanbul. I teach between 18 and 20 students. And by the way, I shouldn't say this, or maybe I should say this, more women than men. Why is it? Why are the women so strong? But I'm really happy. Really good, strong women. And in a class of 20, I have 11 women and 9 men. The men are almost catching up. But it's really a great combination of women and men, people who come from Europe, from Asia, from the Arab world, and we all are focused on civilization and alliance of civilization. But today, I have a task which is very difficult because many people, even in Turkey, even in the institute where I teach, ask, why civilization? Why do we bother with civilization? The world, after all, has nation states. It has a global economy. It has the information age. All of my students are millennialists. Millennial doesn't mean that you believe the world is coming to an end. It just believes the internet has taken over. All of my students grew up thinking that if they could put something on a keyboard, they had all the information in the world. I used to go to a library, pull books off the shelf, take them out, go home and read books. My students say, "Oh no, I can just get this online." Boom, boom, boom. There they have the book on a screen. These are people called millennialists. All you in the middle are millennialists. Some of you are, most of you are not. So I mean, this is the way in which the world is going. And they say, why civilization? It's too big. It's too much to talk about civilization. And my argument is that civilization remains important because it's an envelope. It's a big container of many, many different things which are culture. And in fact, civilization is culture, culture writ large, culture magnified over time and over space. And I want to say that the first thing is space. So even though civilization is an English word, it comes from another word in Greek, ekumene, which is also the same as used in Arabic as, I hope some of you know Arabic, al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun means occupied land. And that's the same as in Greek ekumene. So it's not just a Greek Western term, it's also an Arabic Muslim term, and they both means the world that's occupied. Whether it's al-Mahmud or it's the ecumene, it means world that's connected. So before the 16th century, the discovery of America, the known world was the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific. It went from Africa to Asia. There was no America. Well, of course there was America, but it wasn't part of the ecumene or the al-Ma'mur. And so in one sense, when one talks about civilization, it's cities, it's commerce, it's travel and trade. Of course, it's also warfare, but it's the known world. And what circulates between the known world, that is the basis for civilization. It's space. Space where conferences and exchanges of people take place, and also through trade and business and ideas. Time, that's space. But the time element is much trickier. Where does civilization start in time? I follow, as I said in my topic here, Ibn Khaldun, but also Marshall Hodgson and Richard Bulliet. And I believe that civilization goes back at least to 3,000 before the Common Era. 5,000 years ago. You have to start 5,000 years ago if you think of civilization. And there was a long period of 3,000 to 800 BCE when you had many kingdoms, many civilizations, but they were not communicating at a rapid rate because new technology of travel by sea and by land had not been invented, new kinds of agriculture hadn't come into being, and religions had not come into being. So the great religions of the world really came into being from 800 to 200 BCE, obviously before Islam, but preceding and making it possible for Islam were great religions, Zoroastrianism, Mazdaism, of course Judaism, Christianity, but also Buddhism, Hinduism. Every major religion you can think of had its roots. Confucianism, I should mention, Taoism from China, all had their roots from about 800 to 200 BCE. So when this is talked about in history, it's talked about as being the pre-axial age, which was 300 to 800, before the Common Era. Then the axial period is 800 to 200, and then you have what comes after that from 200 to 1800, and this is Islam. So Islam as civilization comes in the post-axial period. That is the period from 200 BCE to 1800. And you might say, why do I stop at 1800? Because 1800, in my view, you can disagree with me, I'll try and justify it in the Q&A. After 1800, you have the technical age, which is what some people would call the expansion of the West, the colonial, the asymmetry that creates this small little place called the United Kingdom, that is Britain, controlling much of the world, including, of course, India, and then as well the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, all, and Russians, of course. All these become colonial powers from 1800 on. So I would say the ecumene is the basis for civilization, and the time is from 3000 to 800 BCE. Then you have major changes in both commerce and also in ideas and religions from 800 to 200 BCE, and then 200 BCE up to 1800 for 2,000 years. You have post-axial, and then 1800 to now, the technical age. I'm going to skip some of the things that happened in the technical age and really emphasize instead religion. But I want to say that in the way people think about civilization, it is very odd that Islam is singled out as the only one identified by religion. Most people say, oh, when you count civilizations, there's Indian civilization, Chinese civilization, Western civilization, and Islam. These are thought to be the big four. China, India, the West, Islam. But the only one of those four that's named by religion is Islam. The West is a geographic area. Hindu is not just India. I mean, India is not just Hindu, it's all of Indian civilization. It's geographic. China is the great Far East. So I argue this is both a benefit and a limit, that Islam is defined as a religion and not as a place. And we can come back to that later. What happens in modern times is that all of history is divided up into primitive, and then into medieval, and then into modern. And so unfortunately what happens is that people think the modern, from 1800 on, redefines civilization in terms of what Sadipta Kaviraj calls democratic capitalist nation states. That is to say, they have to have democracy, they have to have a basis of economy that's capitalist, and they have a structure of politics that's called a nation state. And he says that because of this, the achievement or the existence of a liberal state is a precondition for modern civilization. So this is now, this is not my view, but this is the view of a very prominent Indian scholar who happens to teach at Columbia University in New York. And his view is that there were other civilizations before modern civilization, but modern civilization has now redefined all the others, the Indian, the Chinese, and also Islamic civilization, and made them all less than, lower than, apart from, and not as substantial as modern civilization. My view, which is also the view of Marshall Hodgson and Richard Bulliet, going back to Ibn Khaldun, is Islam is not separate from other civilizations, but is a part of a single civilization. So my argument and my viewpoint, which are the same, is that one cannot talk about Indian, Chinese, Western, and Islamic civilization. There is one global civilization, the ecumene, which after the 16th century expanded to include North America. But the ecumene includes the whole world, and the whole world is the basis for civilization. There are Chinese, Indian, Western, Islamic accents, Islamic or other kinds of influences and directions, but the basic frame of the entire world as a civilization is not divisible. It is a single world, a single civilization with multiple actors, of which the Islamic influence is extremely important. And I start with Ibn Khaldun because, in one sense, the irony of saying modern civilization is to ignore the fact that civilization as a category doesn't come from Greece, because that was a very limited world of Greece before the Common Era. A very noted historian said, the beginning of the civilization really comes from the Islamic world system between 1000 and 1500. So of course Islam starts, let's say around 600. I know it's a little bit later, but let's say 600. But it's not till 1000 that you have the Umayyad, of course the Rashidun, all this you all know, the Rashidun, the Umayyad, the Abbasid Empire. But by 1000, Islam has begun to expand down into Asia. Very important that it expands, of course, into Asia and South Asia. And it's this period from 1000 to 1500 when Islam begins to become the particular dimension of civilization in Asia. Not in the Middle East, although it's partly in the Middle East, but it's the extension into Asia that begins to define Islam, and then also the extension into North Africa. So it's not so much Islam in Arabia as out to the Maghreb in North Africa and out beyond into Asia, including Hindustan, that is important. And it's in the North Africa that you have the first person who says, you know, I think there's more than states, there's more than societies, and he says there's also more than religion. But he happened to be a Muslim, and he happened to be a jurist, and his name was Ibn Khaldun. And the reason he is so famous today is because he wrote a big history that he never finished. He did an incomplete work. It's called the Kitab al-Ibad. Kitab al-Ibad is incomplete. There are only 3 out of projected 8 volumes. But it was such a tough work, he said, you know what, before I do it, I'm going to write a little introduction. I'm going to call it the Muqaddimah. Muqaddimah is introduction in Arabic. And the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun is the textbook for Islamic civilization. If you've never read it, by the way, I have read it in Arabic. I would say don't start in Arabic. Read it in Urdu. Urdu is easy. There are many Urdu translations of it. Or read it in English. It is a very tough book. Why is it so tough? Even for people who think they know or try to know and express themselves in Arabic. Because what he does is he takes the words that one knows and he gives them different meanings. And I'll give you an example. Badawa and Hadara. Two different instances in the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. He takes these two words, Badawa, that means barbarian, Hadara means civilized. He says, no, Badawa really just means an expansive place which is more open, where people are engaged in everyday life, where they either have farms or they're moving back and forth in the settlements. So it's either traders or settlers, but it's not cities. So Badawa is explained by it's absent. And Hadara becomes cities, the presence of a city. Not as bad traffic as Hyderabad, but they still had traffic in those days. So in traffic, you have big zones, you have commerce, you have different groups of people all together in what are called cities. So for him, the big difference was not that Badawa and Hadara are separate, but that they always interact. And he wanted to describe how the areas that are rural or peripheral interact with and support and connect to the urban areas. So that's a very major point, and he calls this Umran. So remember I talked about Adl Ma'mur? So Ma'mur and Umran come from the same word. Ayn, Mim, Ra, which means something that is occupied, something that's lived in. So he called it his new work, the Muqaddimah ibn Khaldun, he called it the science, the Ilm al-Umran. Ilm al-Umran means the science of the settled world as we know it. So when people say, civilization is a Greek term, I say no. The first person who wrote about civilization was an Arab. Okay, so he's a Maghribi Arab, so he's that kind of Arab, but he's still an Arab, and he's still a Muslim, he's a faqih. But then he has something very tragic happen to him. He was a very brilliant man. By the way, he's a very honorary man. People say he wasn't a pleasant personality. Some people who are brilliant are not nice. But that's okay. Forgive him his bad manners. He still was very brilliant. He lost his family. He's a faqih, a Maliki faqih in Cairo in the late 14th century. His family is coming to see him from Tunis, actually, and there's a shipwreck. All killed, the wife and 6 children. He was not only grieved by it, but he said, I've worked all my life to have some satisfaction in my family. I have no family. I better make sense of life. He retires from a judge. He goes off in meditation. He writes for 12 years. And he starts with the Muqaddimah, and he gets through 3 volumes of Kitab al-Ibad, and he dies. So you might say, that's a terrible life. But what he did in those years, he thought about his own life, not only the tragedies of himself, but of all the dynasties, because he'd been at times not a jurist, but also a statesman. He puts it all together in this one book called the Muqaddimah. Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. So my suggestion to you is, if you've not read it, read it either in Urdu or English before you try the Arabic, unless your Arabic is very good. And then eventually you should, of course, look at the Arabic. But it's an extraordinary book, and it talks about Islam. But it says Islam is a religion which also has to be tested. So he says you have, some of you know these words, bayan. Bayan means you have text. You have, of course, the Quran, Hadith, and Fiqh, and Kalam, and Falsafa. You have all these different texts, and you have Tasawwuf texts. But he says those texts don't really give you irfan. And he was not a mystic. He was not a Sufi or a sheikh. But he believed that knowledge is something you absorb, not something you read, but something you absorb. So he says there's bayan and irfan. But he said the true knowledge is burhan. Burhan means something you can prove, something you can test. So he was not only a jurist and a historian, but he was what we would call an empiricist. He wants to have empirical evidence that tests so you can see it before you know it and before you act on it. Long before we had all this rise of the West where people said, the problem with Muslims and others is they don't have empirical knowledge. Ibn Khaldun was an empiricist before Hume, who was often considered to be the father of empirical thought in the West. That doesn't mean he got it all right, but he got it mostly right in saying you have to know something by seeing it, not just by reading it, and not just by feeling it. So he was a very bright, if tragic figure, and he started us off in thinking about civilization. And this Ilm al-Umran, or what he called sometimes Ilm al-Alam, the other word he used was the science of the world, of the civilized worlds, which he called Umran al-Alam. So this Ilm al-Umran or Ilm al-Alam was for him the basis for everything that could be said about Islam, but also about the civilized world. When I was in Damascus back in the 90s, I had somebody who was a very talented writer, Sa'ad al-Wanus, and he says, you know, this Ibn Khaldun, even back in the 90s, I was loving Ibn Khaldun. He said, oh, this Ibn Khaldun, he was upstaged by Tamerlane. Tamerlane is a great Mongol scholar, great leader who built Samarkand and Bukhara. And Tamerlane and Ibn Khaldun met in 1400. And this friend of mine who's from Damascus says, oh, Tamerlane completely outwitted Ibn Khaldun. He just told him, you know, force prevails. You can never predict anything. Your scholarly work, everything you've done is going to be overshadowed by me. And now, years later, people are going back and they're reading and say, oh, you know, Tamerlane was the more powerful ruler, but Ibn Khaldun was the more powerful thinker. And this book, Munamnamat al-Tarikhiyya, any of you who can read Arabic very well, Munamnamat is shards, little tidbits, and Tarikhiyya is historical. So historical remnants or tidbits by Sa'ad al-Wanus. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but a marvelous who wrote about Ibn Khaldun and said, don't think that he lost. Even though Tamerlane could have killed him, he still outwitted him in some of the arguments. So here's a man who not only was a brilliant thinker, but he could stand up to Tamerlane, which is, I don't know, it's tougher than even standing up to Putin, I think. But I'm not a Russian, so I may be wrong. And I would like to go from my brief comments about Ibn Khaldun to Marshall Hodgson. Marshall Hodgson, like me, also was indebted to Ibn Khaldun and believed that he was the first person to really chart the nature of civilization. And instead of saying, I'm going to talk now about Islam, he talked about Islam within the world, within the Ekimun, or within the Ard al-Ma'mur. And Hodgson said the only thing that has to be done in English is not to talk about Islamic civilization because it sounds as if it belongs only to Muslims, but to say that Islamic civilization is something where Muslims rule, but they can also include non-Muslims. And of course, one of the test cases for Islamic civilization, this is Hodgson's term, was India. And he made the argument, and he made it, if you want to read, he has 3 volumes, all in English, although some people think it reads like German because it's very tough English. But in the 3rd volume, when he's talking about the Mughal Empire, he says, not all the people, as you well know, in the Mughal Empire were Muslims, but they all were shaped by Islamic norms and values because the Mughals, whatever their other faults, were Muslim. So if you can't call all the people in India Muslim, you can say they're part of Islamic civilization because it's Muslim norms and values that shape public life and shape the people within India who are under Muslim rule. So Hodgson was a great admirer of Ibn Khaldun, but because he lived later, because he lived in the 20th, not the 14th, early 15th century, he expanded. And one of my good friends see, this is the internet age. Somebody's calling and I have to listen to the phone ringing before I can say. So one of my friends is a professor, a woman economic professor in Istanbul. Her name is Huri Jahan Islamalu. She just likes to be called Huri, so I'll call her Huri here. Huri, you know, is one of the Huris in heaven. And she's unfortunately here, not in heaven, and I get to enjoy her. So Huri said to me, you know, you understand Hodgson because I've read him and thought about him and taught him for a number of years. She said, but you have to remember that the title of his book, which you correctly gave, is The Venture of Islam, but it's conscience and history. It's not history and conscience. You said it correctly, but many people say, oh yeah, the venture of Islam, it's history and conscience in whatever it is, a world civilization. No, conscience comes before history. And conscience, you say, well, that doesn't sound like an Arabic word. But actually, what he means, and he explains it in volume 2, not volume 1, his conscience for him is all that underlays adab. All the ways in which you suddenly accept people who are different from you, some are lesser, some are more important, but conscience could also be conscientiousness, awareness, but sensibility would be another word, where you're always thinking, It's not just me, it's me in relationship to you, it's me in relationship to you, and now it's me talking before what I thought was an empty group, and it's all filled with SROs, standing room only. So this adab is something that Hodgson says precedes history. You don't go and do a psychological analysis of the Prophet Muhammad or of Ibn Sina or Ibn Khaldun or anybody else and say, oh, this is history. No, you have a conscious or a conscientious, a kind of global view, even when you are in a particular historical moment, particular place. That's conscience. And so Hodgson writes about Islam not as a Middle Easterner. He knew Arabic. He knew Arabic very well. He knew Persian. I even think he knew a little Urdu because he lectured one time at Aligarh Muslim University in 1950, over 65 years ago, almost 65 years ago. But he was against World War II. He was a Quaker by his own, he was not Muslim, he's a Quaker. Although some of my students say his real name is not Hodgson, but Ibn Hajj. So he's already been remade as a Muslim by some people. They say his English name was Hodgson, but he was really Ibn Hajj. I say, okay, go with it if you want. But he was against World War II, and so he was imprisoned because you could not be a conscientious objector very easily in World War II. And you know what he did in prison for 4 years? He didn't learn Arabic. He already had studied Arabic. He learned Chinese. He said, if I'm going to be in prison, I might as well do something useful. And so he learned Chinese. And then he said, oh, this is really interesting. I'll try Japanese. And by the time he got out of prison, he knew Chinese, Japanese, and also some Korean. This man was very, very bright. So he was not just a Middle Easterner. He also cared about the Far East. He cared about the whole world. And so he wrote this book called The Venture of Islam, Conscience and History in a World Civilization. And the question he asked, which everybody should ask, is why the West? Why did the West become so important? Why did it become important at 1800? I mentioned earlier, 1800, beginning of the technical age. Why? And some people call it the rise of the West. Hodgson said, bah humbug. He didn't use that word, but he virtually said, nonsense. It's not true that it was the rise of the West. It was what he called the Great Western Transmutation, not transformation. And any of you who are scientists might know the biology. Transmutation is when you go from one species to another. It's a very gradual shift. It's a transmutation. And so the West became more important, more powerful, more pervasive, not because there was something intrinsic to the West, but because the system of the Ard al-Ma'mur, of the Akum, of the organized world was changing, and the West was able to benefit from it. But it did not mean the West was intrinsically superior. Hodgson resisted saying there's Western exceptionalism or the West is the best. So he talked about what he called, and this sounds a little bit more verbose, more complex than what I explained, but this is Hodgson's own language. It was part of the transmutational character of the new transformation that it broke down the various historical presuppositions in terms of which gradual diffusions had maintained parity among Euro-Asian citied societies. So you know, he actually sometimes used the word Eurasia, but more often Afro-Asian. The whole organized world is Africa, Asia with Europe in between. So either Eurasia or Afro-Eurasia, but the point is that Europe doesn't stand alone. It always stands between Africa and Asia or linked to Asia, because I'm not a geographical primitivist. I don't think geography turns. But if you look at a map, Europe is not Europe, it's part of Asia. And I'm talking about not history, but geography. Europe, what we call Europe, is part of Asia. But because of the technical age, 1800 on, people think of Europe as separate from Asia, and Europe is superior to Asia. That was not the case for the first almost 5,000 years of history. It was only from 1800 on that you get Europe, and then Western Europe, separated out from the rest of Asia and called a separate society. So Hodgson says, let's be honest and let's say there's Eurasian or Afro-Eurasian society. And the Great Western Transmutation, this is to finish Hodgson, once it got well underway, could not be paralleled independently, that is, no other part of the world could catch up with Europe, nor could other parts of the world borrow from it wholesale. So once the Western Transmutation got underway, it could not be paralleled independently, nor could it be borrowed wholesale. The result, this is Hodgson from The Venture of Islam. it also could not be escaped. And so the millennial parity, that is the 1,000-year equality of social power, broke down, and this is his moral judgment, with results that were disastrous almost everywhere. Because when you cease to have parity, you're going to have some people win and lose wars, but there's always the possibility of you lose 1 year or 1 decade or one century and you'll be restored the next. But he says once the social parity, which is also the military, economic, and global parity breaks down, then you can't reverse it. And this is what happened from 1800 on, is this little place called Europe, and later America, for other accidents, became globally powerful. The parity that had existed between India and China, between Islam and many of the Mediterranean countries with which Muslim states were either in Congress or else in competition, that parity broke down. And Hodgson talks a lot more about it, and I'm going to skip over it because I want to just cite one other scholar who's very important in this regard. She's not a scholar of Islam, but she's very much a scholar of economics, Janet Abou-Lughod. She says that you must take seriously that Islam was different than other religions because it had a universal scope encompassing all races, languages, and cultures. This is a woman who was, actually you may have guessed, Abou-Lughod. She was married to a Palestinian, Ibrahim Abou-Lughod. I don't know how many of you know much about Palestine and Palestinian politics, but Ibrahim Abou-Lughod was one of the major figure from Ramallah who really tried back in the 60s to see that the Nakba, 1967, was not the disaster, and of course he failed. But his wife was actually a Jewish American woman named Janet, and Janet Abou-Lughod wrote this book called Islam Before the West, in which she says Islam has a universal scope encompassing all races, language, and cultures. In that sense, it's like every religion. But what makes Islam different is the centerpiece. This is Abou-Lughod now, not Hodgson. The centerpiece of Islamic age civilization was the Indian Ocean. By the way, this is part of what the Indian Ocean is. So the center of Islam is not the Middle East, it's not the Mediterranean, it's not in Ibn Khaldun's time, the Maghreb. She's saying what became true over time is the centerpiece or the core of Islamic age civilization was the Indian Ocean. That is going from Arabia east, not Arabia west. And the Indian Ocean, as a result, kept in play an interregional arena of economic and cultural interaction as the crucial unit within which all civilization played out. So before I skip to Bulliet and then end my brief lecture, I want to say that I agree with Hodgson's analysis and also what Abou-Lughod said following up on Hodgson, that it is a mistake if one thinks about Islam as a religion. Of course, the Hijaz is important, and especially Mecca, for all kinds of ritual and practical and historical reasons. But if one thinks of Islam as a civilization, and the different regions and the people who are part of Islamic or Islamic age civilization, Asia and Africa are as important as Arabia, but the key is Asia. Without the Indian Ocean, and that includes all the areas, but also the ocean and the connection between India and places that are to the west, and India and places to the east, like Indonesia, the archipelago, without that, you do not have something that's called Islamic or Islamic age civilization. You have regional groups and cultures, but you do not have Islamic age civilization. This is the major thesis that goes back to Ibn Khaldun, is amplified by Hodgson, and later also by Abou-Lughod. So I want to make one final point. Richard Bulliet. Richard Bulliet is, unlike Hodgson, somebody who has lived a long life, as was mentioned in the introduction. Thank you for noting that Hodgson was a very creative person. But there's a saying in Turkish, Hibaçat Igalad, somebody starts bright and burns out. He was like a meteor. He burned bright and burned out. He died when he died, as you say correctly, at 68, when he was 46 years old. He's 46 years old. He never completed what we now have as the Bench of Islam. It was notes. And one of his students gave up his own career. This is Reuben Smith. He did the first 2 volumes, 1 and 2, and then he got from different notes of Hodgson and put together what became volume 3. Volume 1 and 2 had been written but not published. Volume 3 was not even written. It was written in parts, and Smith pulled it all together and made that volume 3. So that's how we have the Bench of Islam. Hodgson dies at age 46. He leaves notes. He dies in, as you correctly said, 68. The Bench of Islam is not published till 74. So it takes 6 years after his death to have this book, which we now have in 3 volumes, called Venture of Islam. So Bulliet, unlike Hodgson, lives and still lives a fairly long life, a professor at Columbia, a remarkable individual. He's both, by the way, a novelist as well as a historian. He's written some very interesting and sometimes under a pseudonym, sometimes under his real name, interesting novels. But he wrote this book, which is not a novel, a very serious book. I would actually call it more something that is like a provocation called The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. It came out 10 years ago. For those of you who know a little bit about history, there was a group within America who thought that civilization should not be defined as Western, but since there was Islamic civilization, there should be a counterpart to it called Judeo-Christian civilization. So if you look online, or you even look in the library here, if you're still old enough you want to look at books instead of your internet or your computer or Twitter, you can find books that talk about Judeo-Christian civilization. And Bulliet said, no, you know what, I think there's a better case to be made for Islamo-Christian civilization. So this sounds counterintuitive because Judaism preceded Christianity, but Islam came after Christianity. But his argument, which goes back to Ibn Khaldun, is you do not have civilization before Islam. You have elements of the organized world, but you don't have a framework within which to talk about civilization before Islam. So Bulliet says, instead of saying Judeo-Christian, let us argue for Islamo-Christian civilization. Chronologically, Islam came later, but it built a frame to have a consideration of both Islam and Christianity and their contribution to world civilization. So that's why I think Bulliet's a very important book to remember. And he actually had one prediction that was so beautiful that I cannot possibly repeat it, and so I'm going to quote it. There was a man, I should mention that many people in America are not like me or Bulliet or Hodgson. Many people think that Islam is the enemy, that the only Muslims are Arabs and all Arabs are terrorists, etc. And one of them was a man named Bernard Lewis, who wrote a book called What Went Wrong? And Bulliet says, let's look at what went right. He asked the question that says, what went right with Islam and Islamo-Christian civilization? And he says, and this is Bulliet now, the past and the future of the West, that is to say of Europe and America, the past and future of the West cannot be fully comprehended unless we appreciate the twinned, that is the combined relationship it has had with Islam over 15 centuries. So in other words, if one is going to think about the history of what's happened and the future of what might happen in what's called the West, you can't do it without seeing how Islam and Europe and also the United States have interacted over 14 centuries, and it's that combination of the two that really gives you a perspective of both the past and the future. Each depends on the other. Neither makes sense without its sibling. Each must produce leaders who espouse, embody, and embolden inclusive ideals. And then Bulliet makes a prophecy, and I want to end with this prophecy. Remember, he writes in 2004, and he says, the next 20 to 30 years, so we're now only 10 years, that means we go out 10 more years, we're 2024, 2034. I may not be here, but I hope many of you in this room are here to see whether this prediction's right. If not the next 20 years, 2024, by 2034, we will see Muslim religious leaders of tolerant, peaceful conscience in the mold of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, eclipse and in respect and popular following today's advocates of jihad, intolerance, and religious autocracy. So he is saying that now at the cusp of this new century or millennium, whether you call it the third millennium or the 21st century, that we are only beginning to see Muslim leaders and by extension Muslim movements and societies that will provide a future where Gandhi, King, Mandela, and Muslim leaders will be mentioned in the same breath. And by the way, I want to say, just in closing, that one of the people whom I've been privileged to know is Mohammed Khatami, who was at one point, after the death of Khomeini, president of not the supreme leader, but the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've actually met Khatami. I was in Tehran once at his invitation. And Khatami believed that it was absolutely wrong that Islam and the West were fighting each other. He didn't like what happened when there was the first Gulf War back in 1992, and he worked very hard to see that it would not be continued with other wars. So he got together with several people. He was a Shiite, but he had many Sunni allies, and they put forth a program in the United Nations that was going to call for an alliance of civilizations. It sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? The problem was the date. They had worked so hard to do this. They had all, the summer agenda, when they wanted to put it up, was all full. So someone said, let's put it off to the fall. Let's do it in October. But the year that the Alliance of Civilization, inaugurated by Mohammed Khatami, the president of Iran, was to be put before the UN and voted on, the year that was to happen was October 2001. And so September 11th happened. People forgot about the Alliance of Civilizations. Instead, you had this thing called the Clash of Civilizations, and you've had many of the recurrent nightmares that have come since. So my hope is that even though Mohammed Khatami is no longer president of Iran, that the future of the world, and not just Iran, but the whole Muslim world and the whole ecumene, the whole Alam Mahmud, may be an alliance and not a clash of civilizations. Thank you. They came. So I want to make sure it's clean, that I'm a Princeton graduate, but never contaminated, at least by those three. But my view, very clearly, is that their form of revisionism is blinkered, that it only takes account of part of the evidence. And John Toland, I also know him, and I could give you account of my different moments of debate with Professor Toland. But what all of them do, and by the way, you didn't mention David Cook, so let me throw another one out there, David Powers. David Powers, who's written a book saying that the whole relationship that the Prophet Muhammad had with Zayd was to disempower him so that he could have a relationship with Zayd's wife. Ah, mashallah. You know, you have all these things. So there are even worse things that you didn't mention, could have mentioned, in terms of so-called historical. There's even somebody named Samuel Shoemaker who wrote a book saying, you know, it's really likely that the Prophet Muhammad didn't die in 632, but died in 634. And he's written a whole book, and it's gotten a lot of publicity. People saying, oh, he didn't die in 632. So there was a war which failed, and then he came back, and instead of admitting it, he said he died in 632 when he died in 632. There are a lot of what I would call potboiler theories, pseudo-theses, so-called revisionist views of Islam that I have to read. Because I'm an historian and because I take the trade seriously, I have to read these books. But I would urge you to read when it comes out. It'll be in November. I say this because it's one of my students, but if she were not one of my students, I'd still want to claim her. Her name is Keisha Ali. She's a professor, also a very successful professor in America, and a Muslim, actually a Muslim convert of about 25 years ago. But Keisha Ali has written this book, which will be coming out from Harvard University Press in November, called The Lives of Muhammad. And she takes all these various things you just mentioned, and several others which I don't have time to mention, and she says, all these various, but they don't change the fact that the basic biography of the Prophet, and also this, you didn't mention Wansboro, the whole sequence of the Quran being revealed in the early 7th century and not the end of the 7th century, as Wansboro has argued, that all these theses can be seen as sort of an effort to apply what's called higher criticism to the Quran as it was to the Bible, but not recognizing the difference in both the milieu, the time, and the nature of these two different things. So I think, yes, I take them seriously. No, I don't think they're going to prevail. I hope I'm right.
Thank you. Comment on that. Just a comment on that. What I've noticed is it's probably the sensationalism among certain fringe academics that becomes more popular than regular academics. That's how.
It's the same way in which the jihadis get more newspaper than the people who are the Gandhi-like Muslims. If it bleeds, it leads, and if it's nice, it's dice. It's thrown away.
Thank you. Thank you.
Walaikum assalam.
Your presentation was really excellent and very giving a lot of hope. I would pray for the day when Islamo-Christian civilization, this happens.
Thank you. That's my prayer too.
I would pray.
And may it happen sooner rather than later, inshallah.
And you quoted that Muhammad Khatami from Iran, Islam and the West fighting each other are absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
I believe that. In fact, many Muslim leaders from Muslim countries, they believe in the same way. This is one aspect. Do we feel the same kind of reciprocity? Are the same thoughts are reciprocated in the Western academia and policy making, so that a Islamo-Christian civilization takes place? On one side, it's Muslim thinkers, Muslim leaders. On the other side, it is the West. Especially the superpower of the world, America. Do they reciprocate the same feelings towards Islam? This is my one question.
Okay.
The second question is that for this to take place, Islamo-Christian civilization to evolve, and the topic of today's presentation, civilization dialogue. Earlier it used to happen when things were very open, they were asymmetric. Events were asymmetric. Nobody was controlling.
Yeah.
It used to happen in a natural way. But today what we see that multinational companies and superpowers and Western influence, they control things, they control dialogue. So in the absence of an open air and a lot of people controlling, earlier case was the Judeo-Islam civilization. A counter case was built for Islamo-Christian civilization. So the same people who are controlling the media today, internet, the entire means of communication and means of dialogue are being controlled. So what are the prospects of Islamo-Christian civilization to take place? And Muslim leaders are positive, are the Western leaders as well, and academia positive, are the policy makers positive? What's your model?
Okay. Let me take the second first. Let me come to the question of which economies are engaging in, and take the second one where you mentioned policies and media are controlled. One of the things I find both refreshing and disturbing about the media is it's not controlled. That the millennialists, and I have most of my students, all my students actually are younger than I am, and some of them are quite young. They're young enough to be my grandchildren. But I don't treat them like a grandfather. I listen to them very carefully. And I try and not cajole them the way the Prophet Muhammad did Hassan and Hussein, but try and empower them to say their own speech. They say, you know, we have to choose which we take and which we leave from the internet. The internet is not something that gives you control, no matter how powerful you are. I have many friends who said, you know, it's really terrible the way things worked out in some of the Arab Spring countries. But without the social media, there would not have been the possibility to even think about upseating somebody like Ben Ali or Mubarak or Gaddafi. All these people who were... I went to Egypt in December, just to give you a specific, December of 2010. One of my good friends is a very dissident Egyptian woman named Nawal Saadawi. And Nawal said, Bruce, she called me Bruce in that kind of high tone. Bruce, she says, I am fighting for women's rights, but I will never unseat Mubarak. December 2010. Look what happened. He seemed to be able to control everything. He was gone within 2 months. So I think we cannot understand how change is happening. And so what seems to be control is actually a very slippery slope where there are, especially the young people, especially I think the next generation, are really considering ways that they can have power in public space. If it's not political power, social power. If not social power, at least access informational power. But the line between virtual and real power, I think, has never been thinner and more porous than it is now. I'm not saying that means the world is going to be changed for the better. But what I am certain of is there will be changes that none of us in this room today can predict. Some people get very mad at me and they say, why couldn't you predict the Arab Spring? I say, you're mad at me. Talk to the economists in 2007. These are people who paid a lot of money. I'm paid a decent salary, but not a lot of money. The economists are paid a lot of money. None of them in 2007 got it right, that in 2008 there'd be a collapse. Are they criticized the way we historians are? No, because it's just the economy. The economy? Thousands of people lost their jobs. The whole world was changed. And where I teach now, the Alliance of Civilizations, is in Istanbul. It was supposed to be both Istanbul and Madrid. You know what happened to Spain in 2008? It went down, down, down, because the economists got it wrong. So it's very hard to predict whether it's economics or history. But what you can predict is that change will happen in ways that we can't predict. That's the only prediction that works. The changes will happen in ways that we can't predict. At universities, not all universities are believing in Islamo-Christian dialogue. I didn't want to say that. If I said that, I would be lying. I take it back. It's not my statement. But what I will say is there are more universities that are interested in hiring people who think about Islam in a critical but balanced way. It doesn't matter if you criticize, but you have to balance criticism with also appreciation and where it's possible with praise. When I began teaching in the 1970s, I was in a university which was one of 7 universities where there was somebody who was dedicated to Islamic studies. I was not that person because I, in those days, was studying Indian civilization. To be honest, I knew more about Sanskrit and Hindu civilization than I knew about Islam and the vagaries of Ibn Khaldun and Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu. This is the early 70s. Now, in 2014, there are over 300 places, between 250 and 300 places, where you have people dedicated only to Islamic studies. And guess what? Unlike me, some of these young people are Muslim from birth, or they have been secular Muslims and they've rediscovered an Islam in their life, but also become scholars. So you not only have more places where Islam is taught, and I mean Islam, not simply pablum studies that say, oh, Islam is like Judaism or Christianity, but genuine attention to the difference as well as the coherence of Islam in over 300 places when 40 years ago there wasn't 5 or 6. Does that mean it's all going to get better overnight? No. But it does mean there's change, there's openness. There's been some people who've gone the other way. Let me agree with you that in some places not only is there not Islamo-Christian civilization, but there is bashing or what we call Islamophobic reaction. And I can name a few universities where that happens, but then it would be publicized and they would send me nasty emails. But there are such universities. Afterwards, I can tell you privately. But there are universities which treat Islam as not only a distant cousin, but as an unwanted member of what's called the Abrahamic group of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Mazdaism, Zoroastrianism, and possibly Sikhism. All these are considered to be kind of with an Abrahamic view of prophetic religion. But I would say that the wave of change and the arc of hope is higher and more promising today than it was when I was your age, because you're not more than 35, and I was once that age.
So the second part of my question.
Oh no, you had 2 questions, now you're going to get 3. Okay, I'm fine, go ahead. As long as he tolerates it.
You answered the first part, the evolution of this, the synthesis of the evolution of Islam. The prospects are better. But the second question I told you is that regarding the Muslim countries, Muslim youth today, a lot of people are
how the West is reciprocating.
You wonder how the West was reciprocating.
How the West is reciprocating, particularly the superpower of the world. The superpower of the entire Senate, both the opposition and both the ruling people.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into specifics.
Yeah.
But what is your opinion how the West is reciprocating?
So I thought you were asking about education, and I gave you the answer about educational institutions. But first of all, no. Let me say, I'm like Ibn Khaldun in this. No, I'm not a politician. No, I know. No, I say, I'm like Ibn Khaldun, but I'm not a politician, Monkey. I'm just one who's glad he's not a politician. Every day I pray for President Obama to succeed, and every day I'm disappointed because he's got an impossible job. I mean, I absolutely agree that the West is not, in my opinion, has not done as much or done as well as it could, not just by the Muslim world, but by foreign affairs in general. I think there's a whole set of ways in which, I'll give one specific example. After 9/11, I was a very loud voice and a very prolific writer about one thing. I'm old enough that I served in the U.S. military. I served in the U.S. Navy back in the early, and I was almost part of the Cuban Missile Crisis when there was somebody named Khrushchev and somebody named Kennedy, the 2 Ks, were fighting over a little island called Cuba. Most of my students, they know Cuba is a place where people don't have good cars, but they don't realize it was a place where almost nuclear war happened between the West and the East, between Russia and the United States. So I would have not become a scholar. I wouldn't have had a life. I would have been on a ship that was invading Guantanamo, where they had now keep the prisoners, Guantanamo, which President Obama has tried to close down and not succeeded and gone back and forth on. I would have ended my life in it. But what happened is, luckily that didn't occur, but politics is still very tough. And some bad decisions are made. And after 9/11, I said we should reinstate the draft. I don't think in India there's universal draft. But there is universal draft in Turkey, where I teach. Every male student of mine has had to serve in the army for 2 years. If he can't do it, he has to pay for it, and it's a lot of money. Very expensive to pay your way up. But in the United States, after the Vietnam War, people were so crushed by the foolishness of that war. It turns out, in retrospect, to have been a very bad war. But they abolished the draft. They said, oh, we're not going to go to war, we're going to become a peaceful country. The problem was, war didn't end, the draft did. So I argued, and I still argue, that it would have been much better for the United States to reinstate the draft. And if there are people like Marshall Hodgson who don't want to fight a war, have them go into local communities and do social services or help them be teachers in poor neighborhoods. But there are 1,000 ways in which, even in America, you can serve your country without making yourself wealthy. So 2 years of national service, whether it's military or otherwise, I still think America should have done that. So my only other saying about the politicians in Washington is President Obama can be, and of course should be, held accountable for what he decides to do. But I think he doesn't act alone. And what he succeeded in doing, in my humble opinion, is that he has done more than most previous presidents have done to try and create a better world. It's just that he has not been able to act freely and strongly enough on his own behalf. And even in some cases, I think he's listened to the wrong advisors. But that's another thing where I could be more explicit in detail off microphone instead of on. But I still think we're not on the brink of nuclear war. People say, oh, of course we're not. I said, but listen, I'm old enough that I thought in my lifetime, and this is honest, in my lifetime, when I grew up in the 60s, I thought, first of all, I'm not going to live to be 60. I grew up in the 60s, but I knew, or at least I thought, I'd never grow to be 60 years old because there's going to be a nuclear war. And I talked to other people in my generation, they say, oh, of course, we all knew it. We didn't know it. We supposed it. And luckily we were wrong. Even India and Pakistan, or Turkey, have not come to a nuclear war. There's always the possibility, but however bad politics is now, most people would say, may I not be proven wrong. Inshallah, there will not be nuclear war in your lifetime or mine. Inshallah.
Any question from ladies?
Those are always the toughest questions. I'm lucky if no lady has a question for me.
We'll proceed with the program. I would now request Dr. Khalid to give a copy of Holy Quran to Professor Bruce Lawrence.
New translation.
Just order in English, please. In English. Thank you very much. I have to stand up for this. Thank you very much. It's lovely. Oh, can I just go and read this? I want to go home and read this. I don't want to do anything more here. Because, oh, it's called Good Tree Publications from Hyderabad?
Yeah.
The publisher is in December 2013? Yeah. And I don't have to pay 700 rupees for it? Oh, myself. Thank you. This is what, thank you. If we don't need to do anything else, I got a copy of the Quran. You can send me home tomorrow. Okay. Oh, that's great. Now I have to ask, I know what the Quran is, but I don't know what this is. What is this? This is like an environmental prize. May your tree keep growing. Is that what this is? Environmental prize? I don't know how I'm going to package it, but I'm going to love it all the same. So thank you very much. Let's get it.
Thank you. I would now request Dr. Khalid for the concluding remarks.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Respected Professor Bruce Lawrence, my dear friend Salil Khader and Miss April Wells, and the dignitaries on the dais. I am very much thankful to Allah Almighty for giving us this opportunity. This is really a noble opportunity. I think one of noble opportunity in my life to have this program. I'm very much thankful to Almighty Allah. We have just listened a marvelous, enlightening, and beautiful lecture. The topic was very delicate, and I'm congratulating Professor Lawrence to handle it very carefully, with fragility. Alhamdulillah. And I think this type of discussions will pave the way for better understanding and civilizational dialogue between various sects, communities, religions, regions, etc. Simultaneously, I would like to remind Professor Lawrence that this is the gathering which we gathered by your name and the topic only. The presence of such a huge gathering here shows the interest of the attendees in the topic. We are all thinking about the positive change in the whole world, and we are expecting such kind of communications and dialogue between various communities, and we want to get rid of the situations in which we are prevailing right now. Alhamdulillah, this is the first program from Islamic Information Center. We wanted to initiate such kind of dialogues. We want to invite other religion people also and other dignitaries, academicians on various topics which are related to Islam and other religions, so that a better understanding can be framed. So this is an opportunity for us, and we started our program by such a beautiful lecture by Professor Bruce Lawrence. I don't want to comment on the lecture, and I don't want to be in between the talk and you. I don't want to just waste the taste which I actually observed. This is a very tasty lecture. Literally, I enjoyed a lot, and I'm very much thankful to Professor Lawrence. I hope this kind of relation which Salil and April Veres they offered this type of opportunities for us to make a good relation and to understand in different perspective. I was there in US for in the last 2 months, and I also met very different personalities there. I interacted with various communities there, alhamdulillah. So I hope this kind of activity, this kind of struggle will definitely change the situation. We know that we could not change the politicians as Salim was expecting. But this type of academic activity, this type of sincere, sober activity, this type of interaction will definitely help in paving the way. Jazakallah. And I'll pray Almighty Allah to reward all of you for presenting here in a short notice only. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, all of you. We conclude the program here. I'm thankful to all of you for being part of this program. And inshallah, in future, whenever we organize this program, we request you to be part of it. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.